Hello, Sister Linford. This is Diana Taylor doing my application activity about work that I have done, the things I have learned, and the blessings I have gained. This here is a quilt that I made for my parents last year. 2 years ago, in around 2016 Christmas time, my mother started talking about wanting a family history quilt. Someone at the family history library where she has worked brought one in. She had made it, and so my mother was talking about wanting one. So in January of 2016, I started researching how to make a family history quilt. I've been quilting for 20 years and I'm a very lazy sewer. There are not many things that I do that are done the right way because I like to take shortcuts. So I started by watching YouTube videos and going on Pinterest and researching different forms of quilts, different ways you could do it. And I wanted everything about this quilt to have significance. So the first thing I did was I knew that our family history was British and Irish. So I wanted a pattern that would be reflective of that. So I researched Irish quilt patterns, and I found this, the Irish quilt chain. Reese, if you could focus in on, say, one corner over there. This Irish quilt chain was a very difficult pattern. It was a pattern like I'd never seen before. I had to cut out little pieces of paper, and they were in odd shapes. Instead of being squares and triangles and rectangles, they were sort of, you can see the odd shapes that they were. And so I chose this pattern. I decided to go with it even though it was difficult. So I cut the papers out, but then found out that in order to get the quilt to fit, I had to add a 1/4 inch all the way around each pattern piece for the sewing. Otherwise it was going to turn out too small. So I had to restart some of that. Some of the fabric got wasted. I chose the color blue to represent our British heritage and the color green to represent our Irish heritage. After sewing together the quilt squares, each one of these Irish chain squares is actually made up of 4 smaller squares that you sew together. I counted the number of squares I wanted. The next thing that I started to study and watch videos on was doing mitered corners. Reese, if you could come close up to this corner, please. When you stitch a quilt, and you take the binding and you wrap it around, you sew once. But when you stitch the fabric on the back, the binding, and wrap it around, you stitch a second time, you have to do a different kind of mitered corner. I'd never done this corner before. I had avoided it. I didn't do that kind of binding purposely because I just found it too difficult. So I forced myself to watch videos. I spent hours and hours and hours on YouTube and Pinterest watching other people do these mitered corners. And so that was something new that I learned how to do. The other thing that I learned how to do, Reese, you can focus on any edge actually. You can see there's 2 different colors to the binding. I saw this on a quilt on Pinterest and I thought, I have to have that. I have to do that. And so I learned a new technique. Instead of sewing 2 different bindings on, you stitch the 2 different fabrics together and fold them a certain way so that it looks, this little edge shows of the second colored fabric, and it's ever so subtle. So that was another thing that I learned how to do. The other thing I learned how to do, okay Reese, you can focus on me. When you do binding and you sew the strips together, I would just sew them straight because I'm lazy and that was easiest to do. You're supposed to sew them on an angle and cut it so that it lies flatter, so that it doesn't stretch as much. And I had never done that because, well, I'm lazy. I just sew, I look at things and I do it the way I want. And so I had to learn how to sew that. That was very, very simple. That took no time at all, except when you finish the quilt, and you come to where the beginning and the end join, this is another new thing that I had to learn. Normally I just overlap it, tuck it under, and stitch it straight across this way, which is an unprofessional quilt. That wasn't going to do for my parents. So they have you leave enough tail at each end to stitch it together just perfectly so that when you flip it inside right, it lies absolutely flat and you can't see where the seams are joined. So I spent more hours on the internet watching videos on how to do that. That was something else I learned how to do. So the other big thing that I wanted to do was add this lace. Reese, if you could go on a close-up of the lace, please. So the quilt square is called Irish Chain. And this lace is called the King's Crown. And that's also from our British heritage, if you look at that. So I spent probably 25 hours crocheting this lace to add. And I wanted the lace to lie flat. So what I had to do was stitch down the tip of one crown, slide my needle under the top layer of fabric up to the other crown, one little stitch to tag it down, the needle back under the layer of fabric, back up to the next crown, and so on and so on. So I did that for every single little crown. There's one stitch keeping the crown down so that it would lie flat and not flop about. Then came the most important part of the quilt, choosing photographs. Now my mother's been doing family history for 40 years and we hear stories of my family. And I had never put photographs on fabric before. So again, watching videos, studying how to do that, 2 or 3 different methods. I tried different ways. I went through all my photographs. My mother had given me photocopies of photos. So I was trying to print those. It didn't work on my printer. I went to a local print shop. It didn't work there either. So I had no choice but to go to my parents' house. At the same time as doing this quilt, by the time it came to be December, it was going to be a Christmas gift. It was also my father's 80th birthday, and we're having a huge party for him. And so I used the guise of needing to print stuff for the 80th birthday party to go to the house and print these photographs. So I had to get this special paper and print them. It was fabric on one side that had a solid backing so that as it went through the printer, it wasn't all floppy. So I had to learn how to do that. Printed the photographs, brought them home, wasn't pleased with a lot of them, had to go back to my parents' house. Now my parents live 40 minutes away, so going to their house was not simply just popping 5 minutes down the road. Then I found a file on my mother's computer marked family photographs, and all these photos that I had were in the computer, and I realized the photos would turn out much better if they were printed straight from the computer instead of from a photocopy of a photocopy. Back I go again, and I photocopy the original pictures straight from there. I wanted to choose my pictures carefully, so I started going through our family group sheets. And I hit my first snag when I came to my great-grandmother, Matilda Fricky. Sorry. And her mother is unknown. And that really bothered me, that her mother was unknown. My grandfather, sorry, but he was the youngest of 13 children. He was 5 when his mother passed away. He was sent to the workhouse in England where he was abused. Then he was 9. He came over on a boat to Canada and was sold to a farmer 20 minutes away from where I live now, where he was abused and forced to live in the barn, hardly fed. And as a teenager, he ran away and joined the army. So we don't have a picture of his mother. That made me very sad. But I have here a picture, if you can focus on that. That is his mother's sister. And all of his family was back in England. And the reason, that's great. Right over there, Joseph Whitehead's aunt. Yes, thank you. That's great. All of his relatives were left in England. And so that's the only picture we really have of my grandfather's family. That's his aunt. I don't know why none of these people took in this little 5-year-old boy. So I started with my parents' wedding picture in the middle. And I spent hours. I laid the photographs, if you can picture the photographs, laid out on the floor upstairs. Now, I could have made them all the same size and lined them up perfectly. And then the sashing, which is the fabric in between. Could have been, 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches, and it would have just been so simple. But I didn't like that. I wanted scattered. I wanted different sizes. I didn't want them lined up. So the difficult part was getting sashing for here. Then I had to do sashing down this side. Then I had to do a sashing here. And I would sit and cry trying to get the right size of sashing. You can't see it from far away, but there's 4 seams in here for the sashing around under the wedding picture, and then the sashing down the side. And so I had to learn new skills of putting all this together. Now, I sewed it together by something called free motion quilting. I've only done that once. Prior to doing this quilt, I'd done it. I made a quilt for my son Reese, who's actually filming. I should say that right now. And it was on a small machine. I don't have a quilting machine. It was difficult. So I decided to do the free motion quilting with this. And as I started, you're supposed to start in the corner and go. I decided to start in the middle and work out. Well, the problem is, can you focus on Grandma and Grandpa's wedding photo here? Because I could not stitch over their faces, it doesn't lay flat. So I started to go, and it wasn't laying flat because I couldn't go around, couldn't go over their faces. And one day I just sat crying, and I went to get up, and I tripped over my sewing machine cord, and my sewing machine fell on the floor, and it broke. And so one thing that I learned was that I should have printed photographs, made a tiny little quilt, and practiced stitching over photographs to learn a better technique of what to do to make this lie flat. So, I called my mother crying, and she didn't know what the Christmas present was I was working on, but I'm not 100% satisfied with that. But of course, nobody else notices that, but I do. I notice that. So, those are some of the things I learned. Now, another significant thing, the stitching. Can you maybe, Reese, come in close? I don't think you can see because the stitching's white. I have hearts to represent love. I have books to represent scriptures. And I have sons to represent celestial glory, because we're sealed together as a family and we're all going to the celestial kingdom. So nothing was left to chance with this quilt. There is a song, I believe it's by Matthew Neely, it's a primary song called The Family is of God. So I put the chorus in here. God gave us families to help us become what he wants us to be. This is how he shows his love, for the family is of God. I wanted to tie the gospel into this quilt as well. As I was going through boxes of photos for this, I came across a photograph of my grandmother and my father when he was 2 on his grandfather's farm. Now, this farm is about 20 minutes from where I live now. My father spent a lot of time on that farm. He loved his grandfather, who is this man here. Those are his grandparents. That's his mother when she was young. And he loved being on that farm. And this picture was of my grandmother, young, and my father. She's holding his hands. He's about 2. And she's smiling and laughing. And it struck me how much she loved him. This is the first time I've had that thought, that my grandmother loved my father, which is odd. But being British, there was no I love you, there was no hugging, very stoic, very strict, my grandmother never said the word pregnant. It was always, she's in the family way, she's going to be a mother. So there was a lot of stiffness, and we go to grandma's house and we get the lecture. You sit on the couch, you don't ask for food, you don't touch toys, you behave. Not like our kids who go to grandma's house and they're all over the place. So the blessings that I gained from doing this is knowing how much my family loves my parents, how much they love us. And I could feel the spirit of Elijah. And I'm so grateful I had the opportunity to make this quilt. And so this has been a great blessing to me, to see my family history and tie the gospel all together and to learn new quilting skills. I just want to testify of the importance of families and how temples and family history work is so important to living the gospel. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.